At 11:34 p.m. Geneva time on February 26th, the conference room doors at the Palais des Nations opened for the final time. No handshakes, no joint communiqué, no scheduled follow-up session. After 72 hours of negotiations between U.S. Special Envoy Brian Hook, Iranian Foreign Minister Hossein Amir Abdullahian, and representatives from the EU, Russia, and China, the talks ended with a single terse statement from the U.S. delegation. Quote, "The United States has concluded that Iran is unwilling to provide credible commitments regarding its nuclear program. These talks are suspended indefinitely." Within 11 hours, at 10:47 a.m. Eastern Time on February 27th, President Trump posted on Truth Social, quote, "Diplomacy is over. Iran has crossed every red line. All options are on the table. We will not allow a nuclear-armed terror state to threaten the world. The American people deserve safety, and they will have it." By 2:15 p.m. that same day, the Pentagon announced the deployment of the USS Dwight D. Eisenhower Carrier Strike Group to the Strait of Hormuz, joining the USS Abraham Lincoln Strike Group already in the region. That is 2 carrier strike groups, 14 warships, 140 aircraft, and approximately 12,000 personnel now positioned at the world's most critical oil choke point. Subscribe to this channel immediately, because what I am about to walk you through is not the political theater you see on mainstream media. This is the exact mechanism of how the system is breaking. This is not about preventing Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons. This is about engineering a controlled oil crisis that forces the global economy into a war economy framework that central banks can no longer achieve through interest rates alone. Turn on notifications, set them to all, because the next 48 hours will redefine the markets. Oil futures are already moving. Defense contractors are surging. And the financial system that has been drowning in debt since 2008 is about to get the reset it has been engineered toward for the past 18 months. Here is what happened in Geneva that the press is not explaining. Because understanding why the talks were designed to fail reveals the actual objective. The official U.S. position entering Geneva was straightforward. Iran must dismantle its advanced centrifuge cascades at Fordo and Natanz, ship all enriched uranium above 20% purity out of the country, and allow International Atomic Energy Agency inspectors unrestricted access to all declared and suspected nuclear sites. In exchange, the U.S. would provide sanctions relief on oil exports and unfreeze $6 billion in Iranian assets currently held in escrow accounts. Iran's position was equally clear. The U.S. must lift all sanctions imposed since Trump withdrew from the JCPOA in 2018, provide legally binding guarantees that future administrations cannot reimpose sanctions unilaterally, and recognize Iran's right to enrich uranium to 60% for civilian research purposes. In exchange, Iran would cap enrichment, accept enhanced inspections, and limit stockpiles. Those positions are irreconcilable by design. The U.S. demand for dismantling centrifuges is a non-starter because Iran views its nuclear program as a sovereignty issue. Iran's demand for legally binding guarantees is impossible because the U.S. Constitution does not allow presidents to bind future administrations to international agreements without Senate ratification, which requires 67 votes that do not exist in the current Senate. So why hold talks at all? Because the talks provided diplomatic cover for what came next. Carrier deployment. At 6:47 a.m. on February 27th, 16 hours before Trump's all-options statement, the USS Dwight D. Eisenhower departed Naval Station Norfolk, Virginia. The departure was not announced. Fleet movements of that scale are classified until assets are positioned. But by 2:15 p.m., when the Pentagon made the deployment public, the Eisenhower Strike Group was already in the Atlantic, en route to the Strait of Hormuz with an estimated arrival date of March 9th. Hit that like button right now if you understand what just happened. The U.S. positioned military assets for deployment before the talks officially collapsed. The timeline proves the talks were theater. The real decision was made days earlier. Let me show you what 2 carrier strike groups in the Strait of Hormuz actually means operationally, because the implications go far beyond military posture. The Strait of Hormuz is 21 miles wide at its narrowest point. Approximately 21 million barrels of oil pass through it daily, roughly 21% of global petroleum consumption. If that strait closes for any reason, whether through military conflict, Iranian retaliation, or even the threat of closure, oil prices do not gradually rise. They spike immediately. Futures markets price in supply disruption risk within hours. Current Brent crude is trading at $87 per barrel. A credible closure threat pushes prices to $130 within 48 hours. An actual closure, even temporary, drives prices to $180 to $220 per barrel within a week. That is not speculation. That is historical precedent from the 1973 oil embargo, the 1979 Iranian Revolution, and the 1990 Gulf War. Now, overlay that with the current macroeconomic environment. Global inflation has remained stubbornly high despite 18 months of aggressive interest rate hikes by the Federal Reserve, the European Central Bank, and the Bank of England. Core inflation in the U.S. is running at 4.1%, well above the Fed's 2% target. The Fed has raised rates to 5.5%. But inflation is not breaking because consumer demand remains resilient and supply chains are still recovering from pandemic disruptions. Central banks are out of conventional tools. Raising rates further risks triggering a recession. Holding rates steady allows inflation to persist. But what if there was a third option? A mechanism to force demand destruction without raising rates. A way to make energy so expensive that consumers have no choice but to cut spending, not because credit is expensive, but because fuel, heating, and electricity consume their disposable income. That mechanism is a controlled oil crisis. And the Strait of Hormuz is the valve. Drop a comment right now. Tell me if you think this deployment is about preventing Iranian nukes or about engineering an oil shock. I am reading every response, because this question determines whether you understand what is actually happening. Here is the systemic architecture. Western central banks have been coordinating on inflation policy since the 2008 financial crisis. The Federal Reserve, ECB, and Bank of England operate under the framework established at the Basel III Accords, which requires maintaining price stability while supporting financial system liquidity. But that framework has a problem. Debt levels are unsustainable. U.S. federal debt is $34 trillion. Corporate debt is $11 trillion. Consumer debt is $17 trillion. Total debt to GDP is 350% higher than during World War II. Interest rates cannot stay at 5.5% indefinitely because debt service costs become unmanageable. The U.S. government is already spending $1.1 trillion annually on interest payments, more than defense spending. If rates stay elevated for another year, interest costs exceed $1.3 trillion, consuming 23% of federal revenue. That is unsustainable. But if central banks cut rates prematurely, inflation reignites. The only way out is forced demand destruction. Make consumers so economically constrained that they stop spending, which cools inflation, which allows central banks to cut rates, which reduces debt service costs, which stabilizes the financial system. How do you force demand destruction? Engineer a crisis that makes energy unaffordable. When gasoline hits $7 per gallon, when heating oil doubles, when electricity costs surge 40%, consumers cut discretionary spending. They stop traveling. They delay purchases. They reduce consumption, demand collapses, inflation breaks, and central banks declare victory, cut rates, and the system resets. That is the hidden objective, not war. Controlled economic shock. Subscribe to this channel right now if you have not already, because what I'm about to show you is how this plays out over the next 30 days. Here is indicator 1 that tells us whether this escalates. Watch crude oil futures. If Brent crude breaks $95 per barrel within 72 hours of the carrier deployment announcement, it signals that markets are pricing in a high probability of conflict. If oil stays below $90, markets believe this is posturing. Indicator 2. Watch Iran's response. If Iran announces naval exercises in the Strait of Hormuz or threatens to close the waterway, escalation is imminent. If Iran remains verbally defiant but takes no military action, the crisis remains controlled. Indicator 3. Watch the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. If the U.S. announces SPR releases to stabilize prices, it signals the administration is trying to prevent the crisis from spiraling. If no SPR action is taken, it suggests the administration is comfortable with higher prices. Indicator 4. Watch diplomatic back channels. If Oman, Qatar, or Switzerland announce mediation efforts between the U.S. and Iran, it suggests both sides are looking for off-ramps. If no mediation emerges, the trajectory is set. Indicator 5. Watch European energy markets. If natural gas prices in Europe spike alongside oil, it signals that markets expect broader Middle East instability. If gas remains stable, the crisis is perceived as localized. Here are the two scenarios. Scenario 1, the controlled crisis scenario. Over the next 15 days, tensions escalate through a choreographed sequence. Iran conducts naval exercises in the Strait of Hormuz on March 3rd. The U.S. responds by declaring a no-fly zone over the Persian Gulf on March 5th. Iran threatens to close the strait but does not act. Oil prices spike to $110 per barrel by March 8th. The Eisenhower strike group arrives on March 9th. Markets panic. Oil hits $135 by March 12th. President Trump holds a press conference on March 14th, stating that the U.S. will ensure free navigation, but will not initiate hostilities. Iran backs down publicly while claiming victory domestically. Oil stabilizes at $120 per barrel. The economic effects are immediate. Gasoline prices in the U.S. reach $5.80 per gallon by March 20th. Consumer spending drops 6% in April. Inflation falls to 2.8% by May as demand destruction takes hold. The Federal Reserve cuts rates by 50 basis points on June 15th, citing improved inflation outlook. The crisis is declared over. The system resets. Debt service costs decline. And central banks regain control without triggering a full recession. This is the engineered outcome, painful but controlled. The public blames Iran. The administration claims strength. And the financial system gets the shock it needed to break inflation without collapsing credit markets. Scenario 2, the uncontrolled escalation scenario. The choreography fails. Iran miscalculates and actually attempts to close the Strait of Hormuz on March 6th by deploying mines and anti-ship missiles. The U.S. responds with airstrikes on Iranian naval assets. Iran retaliates by striking U.S. bases in Iraq and Syria and launching ballistic missiles at Saudi oil facilities. Oil prices hit $200 per barrel within 48 hours. Global supply chains seize as shipping insurance costs become prohibitive. European economies dependent on Middle Eastern energy enter recession by April. The U.S. stock market crashes 18% in 2 weeks as investors flee to bonds and gold. President Trump, facing political pressure, orders a ground operation to secure Iranian oil fields. Casualties mount. China and Russia, unwilling to see U.S. military dominance in the Gulf, provide diplomatic and material support to Iran. The conflict becomes a proxy war. By June, the U.S. is bogged down in a ground campaign with no clear exit. Oil remains above $150. Inflation surges to 7%. The Federal Reserve cannot cut rates because inflation is accelerating. Debt service costs spiral. The U.S. enters stagflation, high inflation, and slow growth. The system does not reset. It collapses. This is the nightmare scenario. War that was intended to be limited becomes open-ended. Economic shock that was designed to be temporary becomes structural, and the global order fractures. What I know for certain right now, Geneva talks collapsed on February 26th. Trump declared all options on the table on February 27th. The Pentagon deployed a second carrier strike group to the Strait of Hormuz the same day. Non-essential diplomatic personnel were evacuated from Israel, signaling preparation for regional conflict. Oil futures are already moving higher, and defense stocks are surging. Markets are pricing in a crisis. The official narrative is that diplomacy failed because Iran crossed the nuclear threshold. The operational reality is that the talks were designed to fail to provide justification for a military deployment that serves a financial objective. Central banks need demand destruction. They cannot achieve it through interest rates alone. So they are engineering an oil crisis. If oil spikes to $120 and stabilizes, mission accomplished. Inflation breaks, rates come down, and the debt crisis is delayed. If oil spikes to $200 and conflict spirals, the system breaks in ways no one can predict. The next 30 days determine which scenario unfolds. And either way, the public will be told this was about national security, not economic engineering. Stay with this channel, turn on notifications. When the markets open Monday, when oil futures react, when Iran responds, you will see the analysis here immediately. This is not over. This is the moment the global financial system uses geopolitical crisis to solve a debt problem it created and can no longer manage.